Good. So I'm aware also we've got people viewing online, so we'll look for questions there as well. So any questions for members of the panel? And if when you ask your question, you could give your name and organisation for everyone. Yes, over on the right there.
My name is Moaz Salisu from University of Aberdeen. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. My questions goes to the first speaker, Dalu, and also I may chip into what the last speaker said. In your deliberation, you made mention of repurposing of existing structures or existing facilities. And at the same time, the last speaker also made mention that some of the money that was being kept for the decommissioning is being maybe utilized for some other purposes, maybe during pandemic and what have you. So that means repurposing is inevitable because we are trying to see how to save cost. But unfortunately, some of the existing laws that we have doesn't address some other issues. As we are all aware, world is set to transit from fossil energy to some other source of energy, maybe like hydrogen and some other things. So what is the government and what government regulators, standard organizations, private sectors, what step are they taking to see how this law is being reviewed so that it can accommodate these kind of things? Because it doesn't make sense for somebody that maybe you have a huge investment, but you don't have a regulatory framework that will cover your investment. So I think it's good to see how to address this issue because it's something that can affect our investment, the taxpayers, and everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Mark, do you want to try that one first?
I mean, I think the first point to touch on is that it's sort of driven by international agreements. And so anything that would result in change would have to be taken forward and agreed at an international stage. It's not just for national governments, but has to be discussed internationally as well.
And I think you mentioned you also wanted Dickon to have a word at that one as well, yeah.
So I think John made a really good point at the beginning about what does the law require you to do and what should you do. And as Mark said, the international agreements require us to do some things. And what you should do as a regulator is that you need to work within that framework to do what you think is the right thing to do with regards to the policy that's driving you. And so there's a question about what's the legal framework look like, and that's quite difficult to change. What does the policy framework look like, and that's less difficult to change. And yeah, so it's making sure that both those things are fit for purpose, I think. In terms of the money issue, I think that it's normal. The government is running a business effectively, and they're looking at cash flow that's going in and out. And there is a real kind of drive to make sure that we are looking at decommissioning of structures in the most cost-effective way possible, because of cost to industry and cost to taxpayer. But we have environmental regulation for a reason. We have environmental regulation, and it has some quite hard lines in it, so that we can make sure that actually we are protecting our environment and restoring it. The challenge I think we've got at the moment is that when you look at good environmental status, the measures around environmental regulation are all about getting us to no net loss, so do no harm. But if you do no harm on a baseline that is declining, all you're going to do is keep declining. So there's a really important point about just doing no harm isn't good enough. We need to be looking at restoration, and then there's a question about what restoration is good restoration, which we've been talking about a lot the other day. So there's lots of open questions there, but yeah, there's lots of sort of different bits of the jigsaw that need to move, I think.
Thank you. Now, we've got a question online I'll go to first, and then I think gentleman at the back will be next after that. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, we've got one for Dickon and then one open to the panel. Both from Anmet, who's asking Dickon if she wondered how you'd see the perspective for nature-positive decommissioning without more opportunities for partially leaving nature-strengthening elements of the structures offshore as artificial reefs in some form, if you want to add to that. And then the question for the rest of the panel that relates to that is, what do you think about setting up one or more pilot projects exploring nature-friendly decommissioning in practice?
Thanks. So in my mind, there are two ways you can do nature-positive decommissioning. You either make the most use of what you've got there already, or you go and develop something else somewhere else. And if you look at the way that we've dealt, we're currently looking at biodiversity net gain terrestrially. It's based on a model of you're either providing restoration on the site where you are, or building that into your design, or you're buying credits or buying into a scheme somewhere else where you're providing offsets in other places. So it's one of those two options, really. And the question is whether those two options are possible within the current regulatory framework and have good ecological success criteria around them, both of which we don't really know at the moment.
So for the second question, then maybe you start with Jasmine. Would that be okay?
Yeah, so a test and demonstration, was that the question? Yeah. So with Nature Scot, our remit is within the 12 nautical mile zone, so decommissioning of oil and gas structures is slightly out of my comfort zone. But I personally think with decommissioning, setting up a test and demonstration, you know, that's the kind of thing that we need to see probably to move forward with this. And if you're going to have derogations in place already with the OSPAR decision, and that structure is going to be left regardless, then you could set up some sort of scientific experiment or test and demonstration around that. I think that would kind of be the best way to go. And then you're not breaking any kind of legislative requirements in that aspect.
Any other members of the panel? Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I think to add on that, and from a purely from my background as an ecologist and from a personal level, I can't speak to larger funded pilots or so on and so forth. However, on a scientific basis, yes, I think that would be incredibly viable, as Jasmine said as well. I think it'd be fantastic to have that sort of pilot program if it could be put into place. I think if it were to be put into place, you would want to try and capture and make it, as with any experiment, as real as possible, because all experiments are assumptions that you make and continually. So it would need to take into consideration what we've raised today. It would need to take into consideration the economic background, the socioeconomic background, the industry background, to be, I think, fully useful. But from a purely ecological standpoint, I think it'd be incredibly useful. And I was amazed by the talks yesterday and through previous Insight and SIMEs about the incredibly viable work that everyone's doing, essentially, which looks into a sort of model approach, not perhaps going full pilot, but looking at each individual element of, hey, if we were to do this, what does it look like, and what are the benefits here? So yeah, I would, on an ecological perspective, I'd be positive with that.
Thanks, Chris. Anyone else want to go ahead with that, or? Yes, Mark, on you go.
It's probably worthwhile highlighting as well, and I think I'll just come back in some of the points you were touched on in your own presentation, John, on that subject. We were looking at the OSPAR guidelines for artificial reefs and taking things forward. I mean, other actual guidelines that I would recommend people looking at is there's also artificial reef guidelines under the London Convention Protocol, which actually go into a lot more detail than what OSPAR does, and in terms of what the requirements and what the basis could be for developing an artificial reef. And so there is other things under international agreements that need to be looked at as well, and how things can be taken forward. So there is lots of guidance developed as worthwhile looking at and investigating. In terms of how possible it is, we're not the sort of consenting authority for that, so I can't say how easy it would be to go through that process for doing an artificial reef, but certainly there's a lot of useful guidelines available people could look at beyond just OSPAR as well.
Chris, yes.
Sorry, just another point as I was thinking about that. There's also, you know, I think it was mentioned in a talk yesterday, other countries and internationally have done rigs to reef and have put things into place, artificial structures, artificial coral reefs, so on and so forth. So there's a lot to learn and to be aware of in the international community as well. Granted, our situations and in any biological environment, as you move from place to place, it's going to be slightly different, it's dynamic, but those pilots, those projects, they exist in internationally. And so there's a lot to be learned from the international community as well that could be applied here.
Thanks very much. Now, there's a question at the back, was the next one there. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
So Richard Thompson, University of Plymouth. There's two parts to this and they're linked. The first one that concerns me a little bit is how do we avoid setting a precedent? I mean, we're talking about structures that were put in a long time ago without perhaps enough consideration at the time about removal. And so now we're looking at a range of things that might involve leaving them in place, and we're talking about artificial reefs, and that may be the better option than the damage caused by pulling them out. But there must be a carrying capacity for our seabeds, for structures. We've got additional ORE going in. How do we make sure that, you know, relaxation or a kind way of dealing with the things we put in the past, because we didn't think about it, doesn't create a precedent for the same practices to carry on into the future? And then linked to that, and I guess I'm thinking this might be to Chris, and I'm thinking about it's a question of scale, really, and the biodiversity. And it troubles me a little bit, and I think there was confusion in the room yesterday. I mean, of course, if you put a hard structure in a place where there was no hard structure, at the scale of that installation, you have increased the biodiversity. But if you've simply moved around species that are already abundant or common in UK waters, has that done anything to, you know, reduce biodiversity loss? And how do you see that? Because I often feel it kind of fairly flippantly tripped out that we're adding a reef and it's increasing biodiversity. And are there examples, perhaps, put the fisheries to the side for a minute and the fisheries enhancement, are there examples where we've seen these structures boosting the abundance of something that is threatened in some way from a biodiversity perspective? So again, it's back to the scale, and it's how many structures do you need to achieve that? So the first part's about the precedent, and the second part's about, are we genuinely addressing biodiversity loss, and if so, at what scale?
Those are really excellent questions, and it's something that I from a personal level, have battled with, I guess, for a long, long time. In the scientific community, we often come back to what is the baseline, you know, and I think, Dick, and you had just mentioned that as well, actually. When we look at the post-industrial revolution, is that our baseline, or is it 10 years ago, or is it 100 years ago, or, you know, so on and so forth? I think I don't have an answer for you, unfortunately, and I don't have the metrics with me today, and I'll open up the question to the panelists as well, because it's a fairly wide and interesting question. But I get your point. It's enhancing biodiversity in an area where there wasn't a solid structure beforehand is an interesting concept, and it's, are we, you know, and then it introduces almost philosophical questions about, is this enhancing biodiversity where there was, you know, not the same before? Is that correct? Is that, you know, is that right? But then, of course, we've shifted so much in the marine environment that it's, well, what baseline are we working upon? So that's a bit of chicken and egg there, but I hope you get my meaning. On protected species, so we saw some really fantastic imagery, I think, in John's talk on Lophelia, which was just, I've seen that sort of footage before in my previous job. And so that is, you know, to talk about a case of where it has proliferated a protected species, that's very evident. And I think from my experience back then, looking at marine growth or marine fouling on oil and gas infrastructure, which was part of my job 2 jobs ago, it was sort of disheartening to be working on the decommissioning plan for those structures, seeing them so vivid of life. And so, yeah, that's just something that, as an ecologist and a biologist, that I need to work through. And that's where I gained that passion that I'm hopefully expressing today at Insight and this group, and that's what I'm really fascinated by. But I'll open up that question to the panel just in case everyone else wants to come in, because it's incredibly wide. Thank you.
It's a great question, Richard, and as Chris said, I don't think there's a straight answer to it, to be honest. I think when you're looking at the second question about what biodiversity is good biodiversity, Colin articulated some of that really well yesterday. I think that we are going through a period of unprecedented environmental change, and whether it is appropriate to look backwards to what the North Sea was, or whether it is more appropriate to look forwards and to say, what do we want the North Sea to be, which of course is informed in part by looking backwards. That setting of targets and where we want to go, that is informed by some of the science we heard yesterday. I think I'm not an ecosystem modeller, but just having sort of sat on the edge of that for the last decade, the advances in understanding ecosystem modelling, ecosystem functionality, and actually getting benthic people, fish people, bird people, plankton people, and all the oceanographers in a room together talking about stuff is happening so much more than it was a decade ago. And that's brilliant, because we need all of that understanding to answer your question, I think. In terms of the precedent, I don't think you can avoid setting a precedent, because the first time you make a decision, you're going to set a precedent. The important thing is understanding, as far as possible, what the implications of that precedent are before you make it. And where there is risk, that you're controlling that risk in an appropriate way. And as an ex-regulator, it's always a balance of judgment about the information you've got in front of you, the risk that you think is there, and how well you can control that. And when you're talking about risk at a site level, but if you're talking about potential risk at a much broader biogeographic scale, then that becomes more difficult. And but again, I think the work that's come out of Insight, that's coming out of EcoWind, that's coming out of things like the whole seabed programme with the Crown Estate, is taking quite big strides in helping us manage that risk.
Thanks very much indeed. Another question, there's one here, I think was the next one. Yes, I think it's probably going to be our last question given timing, but yes, go ahead.
I need to give a little bit of an introduction, but I'll warn you, I'd like to ask you to operate into DEFRA, and it's about precautionary principle. So if OSPAR is about protecting the environment, and if in the late 90s, clean seabed was thought to be the way to do that, and if we saw that yesterday there were mixed results maybe about whether structures have a positive or a negative effect, but quite promising results at the same time. Just think about Molly's work, where Central North Sea was quite essential. And then with those pressures on the North Sea and also the knowledge that it's degrading, why are you not calling on the precautionary principle and put a moratorium on all further removals until the science has actually found out what's going on here? So I would say we're in a situation where the sea needs a lot of support and restoration, and you have a few tools, these platforms, to really potentially support you. But the science is still out. I'm Bert Fokkema, I work for Shell. We are removing the structures. If we talk a little bit longer asking interesting questions, then they will be removed. So this is the opportunity time. How do you use that? And could you use the precautionary principle to do that?
Interesting question. Who'd like to take that? It was for DEFRA, yeah. No, who did you have a particular panel member in mind, sorry? DEFRA and OPRED. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I guess one of the purposes behind the OSPAR Convention in terms of precautionary principle would be towards working towards a clean seabed and without waiting for the scientific. So I think there's it's what is very specifically in the OSPAR Convention. I can understand why people may be asking that question, but also I think it's also worthwhile to highlight, as we're moving, we've obviously got the underpinning OSPAR Convention as well, but in terms of working areas and introduction of new policies in OSPAR, they will evolve through time, and there'll be new OSPAR decisions implemented through different aspects to address it. But the actual OSPAR Convention doesn't provide that remit to pause the process and the sort of how it works in a practical sense.
Yeah, I don't think I have thanks very much. I don't think I have really much to add there, apart from being at Insight and seeing the wealth of evidence that we have. It's about generating and filtering almost and refining that evidence together to be able to take a based approach, a risk-based approach maybe. And it's until we have that wealth of evidence that we know is true before decisions are made. So yeah, I think it's an iterative process. And yeah, I think that's all I can really say to the matter. Yeah, but thank you for your question.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very mindful of time, and I'm going to thank the panel in just a second. Just to let you know that in half an hour's time, the next session will be beginning, session 6, What Can Environmental Research Do to Support Delivery of North Sea Management Priorities? So I invite you back for that. Before then, we have a coffee break, and going into that, can I please ask you to thank all of our panel members for an excellent session. Thank you.